Did you hear that? Oh,
Yep.
you give permission. Yeah, so I kind of, woke up to the news, today of the mandated training for police officers, and I thought of you, and I thought, that was what we were talking about.
Indeed.
So what were your thoughts when we
Is that as far as you got?
Well, in terms of my thinking? No,
Yeah.
no, there's plenty more, but I'm waiting.
No, go on.
No, and I was just curious really to hear, some of the conversations which followed about, well, actually, what does this mean? And we've been here before, and will it actually make any difference? So it started making me think about, okay, so what actually needs to happen differently in terms of these courses for them to actually be different and to be more impactful, so that we're not back where we started and kind of thinking we've been here before.
Well, I had exactly that same thought thus far. What was your next thinking?
Well, what I thought, without being arrogant, was, well, they need to bring in fresh blood. They need to bring Penny and I in to solve the problems, and I really do believe that the 6 stages framework offers something new and something different, and that, fresh approaches are needed in tackling the problems, which we've
Okay,
seen.
So far, you were inside my head. Keep going. Or I was inside yours.
Yeah, one or the other. So the question then becomes, how do we get the work in front of the right people to enable them to see just how valuable this, this work and this framework is in terms of moving forward these conversations?
I had exactly the same thought.
Right.
So there are 48 different police authorities.
Yeah.
So if we started now, we would have no time to do anything else until we died. So obviously that is an impossibility. So to your point about how do we get it in front of somebody, I think, where is the chink in the armor? Who would be most likely to open the door, pick up the telephone, and why? So, I don't know the answer to that, but clearly we've been asking the same question.
See, my view is that they're probably not going to have just one trainer. They'll probably get a selection, mind you, in terms of quality assurance, they probably need to have some consistency. But I'm kind of thinking that they'll probably look to getting a number of trainers to manage the workload and what needs to be done.
Yeah, but we have to remember that there are 48 different police authorities, so they aren't even necessarily going to make the decision together because they manage
No, true.
So they've all agreed they need to do it, but what happens now will likely be not a central idea. They'll talk to each other, and therefore if you do a good job, then that will pass over. But I'm not entirely convinced that they will come up with a uniform answer at this point. In fact, I'd be surprised if they do. They might, but I'd be surprised if they do. So really it is, I mean, one could do a scattergun effect. One could write to everybody and see who picks it up. But if there is somebody who knows somebody, I mean, that's how that's how the rest of the world operates. And I'm sure it happens here.
Yeah.
It's not about forcing, it's just about opening the door.
Yeah.
So how does one open the door or get the right telephone number or whatever? And last time I had to think about this, I was thinking about the policeman who I studied with back at the LSE, and the one who I knew would answer my call. I actually tracked him down, but he died. So that's not my tune.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not going to be helpful.
That's
Yeah.
my other difference though is going back to this sort of divide and not combine, is my thinking was, so the 6 stages framework is a structured way in. It's also published. So that's a good thing. But I wanted to add to that there are other bits to making something different. So why is this, the first thing is, why do you think the 6 stages framework is different to other things? And that can be said. But the other bit that I felt was that it all talks about training of the police. So the 6 stages framework already changes that narrative, because it's saying it's not of them, it's a reflective process for an individual. So there's already kind of a different level of ownership than training that comes in and is just given, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
But, and here's my but, no, it's not a but, it's a plus. That where my brain went to is, if you took responsibility for that and managing that whole bit, where would my role be? And I felt what I really want to do is go into community narratives. My whole process of rewriting my CV and everything has led me into that space. That's where I want to be. That's what gets me excited. And I thought, well, it does actually have a role in this, because the story on the press this morning about that girl who was searched.
Yeah.
There is always an interaction in any situation. There's always somebody that's going to tell the story for somebody else. And what needs to be said is the story needs to be told by the person whose story it is. But if the other viewpoint is not there in the room when it happens, again, it gets messed. So what I thought would be good would be to try and get the police directly involved in the community narrative. So it's not just about sessions about self-reflection, but having gone through that, having got the strength that gives you, you then maybe have the courage to listen more openly. And if somebody's listening to you more openly, now that's the community bit, then you also might be more honest in your narrative. And so then a mutual trust builds up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it reminds me of something I heard this week, where someone was talking about, actually, I think it was someone being interviewed following, the report of the young girl who was strip searched. So not child Q, but the second girl who's just come to light. And I think, and there was someone, in one of the charities, who was interviewed, and she actually said, we need to be prepared to listen to understand rather than listen to respond.
Yeah.
And I found myself thinking, wow, that really resonates with that, that whole concept around high quality listening, and the fact that usually within these conversations, we're sitting there waiting to get our point in and to challenge the other perspective rather than actually just purely listening, trying to understand what the other person is saying.
Yeah.
And and what you're saying about the community narratives again resonates with an experience I had, because I was in Scotland last week. Well, this week, just got back. And there was I met, so let me tell you a story. So I met these two guys, from Bolton, of all places, and and I've never been to Bolton.
And maybe you don't want to go.
No, just quite interesting. I was sitting there kind of having my cup of coffee, midday, and they came in because St Andrews is very much kind of a golfing town. So they were there to play golf, but they came in and there was a snooker table near where I was sitting. So they started playing snooker. So we then had this conversation with me sipping coffee and then playing snooker. And this guy, who was the more talkative of the two, started to, after I'd kind of told him that I'd published a book and what my book was about, he started to tell me a story of his own experience. And he sort of said, he had been in an incident last year where a couple of dark-skinned colored guys, this is how he described them, had approached him and they tried to steal his car or to tamper with his car or something of that effect. And he then became involved in this altercation with them and struggle with them. And he said he suddenly found himself saying things which he had never thought would come out of his mouth.
Even in his head, yeah.
Even in his head. So he came out with all of this kind of racial torrent of abuse towards these two dark-skinned colored guys, which totally surprised him, so he says. And it got so bad that it ended up in court. So he was charged with racial slander, racial violence, or whatever, and had to do community service as a result. And what he was saying is that on the one hand, his story was, I was so shocked that, given that they were the ones in the wrong, that I was the one who was being punished. And we then kind of, so we got into this kind of, listening, where I was kind of listening to his story and, and trying to move him along in his thinking at each point. And one of the things I was, I sort of, said to him, reflected back to him was, that obviously he felt that he was being kind of, being painted as the wrongdoer when actually these other guys were to blame. And also how his experience had kind of, had ultimately colored the way he perceived any dark-skinned people he came across.
But why was he talking to you then? I wonder. I mean, I'm not expecting you to have the answer. I'm just wondering.
Well, I think he was talking to me because I was there. So, in a hotel setting, I was sitting there having a coffee. He was playing snooker, and the conversation went deeper than either of us would have imagined it was going to.
Well, I mean, to me, that implies that the kind of cut and dried idea that they were in the wrong, I was in the right, isn't actually the way he sees it.
Well, absolutely. But then, yeah, and that's where the self-reflection, the opportunities for that self-reflection allows him to voice how he really sees it, and also allows him to process that and kind of move him on. So it was quite clear that he regretted every bit of what had happened, and he wanted to put things right, but he was still angry at what had happened. So he then told me, so the other thing he told me was that as part of the community service, he had to go and work, he had to go and work in this charity shop, and And so he was, his usual job is as a construction worker. And so he was standing in the window in this charity shop, dressing this mannequin, as it were. And his father, who used to be in the military, walked by him and saw him in the window and kind of couldn't understand, what are you doing there? It's just like, so he hadn't told his father that he had, got this criminal, a record where he'd go and do this community service. So he then had to explain to his dad why he was in that, why he was in that shop, and what had happened.
Yeah.
And he told his father what had happened. And he sort of said, he remembers just how shameful he felt in terms of what had gone on, but it also gave him an opportunity to reflect on his own experiences as a young person and some of the experiences he had had in terms of kind of where some of the thinking and some of the words, may have come from. So it was fascinating. It was really interesting. And the more he spoke, the more he was able to just kind of shift a little bit in his thinking and to actually say, actually, I know it's not right, but I do find that I tend to tarnish everyone with the same brush these days. And what was really, really interesting is that his brother-in-law, who was also there playing snooker with him, was much more entrenched in his views. So his whole rhetoric was kind of, well, actually, everything these days, what I find difficult is that when you're with, colored people, this is his words, that everything is about race. Even if it's not about race, everything is about race. And you say something and it's like, oh, that's about race. And then he told me a story about someone he works with where he felt that they were just, making everything about race. So he was very much kind of shut off to any kind of conversations or books about anti-racism, because he thought, and he said to me, maybe we spend too much time talking about things like this. We shouldn't talk about things like this because everything's about race.
Well, I'm thinking that those two viewpoints are well there in the police.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, and I really found, I really found the conversation really, really powerful and empowering because, and I remember I sort of had a supervision session with, a couple of psychologists afterwards, and I kind of shared it with them. And I wish I'd recorded it at that point, because I think it would have been much clearer and probably much more, it would have come to life in a slightly different way. But I really found myself, and I say to him afterwards at the end, because I actually realized that I had a meeting and I'd run off, and I just said to him, thank you so much for that, because I feel that was a really great conversation. And he looked at me and he said, do you think so? And I just said, yes, because I think, I believe in conversations that make a difference. And I feel that you made a difference to my thinking, and I hope that I made a difference to your thinking as well. And he nodded his head and said, yes, thank you.
I mean, I do actually think that writing this down is a great vignette.
Absolutely. And that's what I came away from. So when you were saying about community narratives, that was something I jotted down in my thing about actually, how do we capture these scenarios as vignettes and then analyze them and talk about them. And I met someone else who said, that's right, I met this woman whose daughter is at St. Andrews, and she's from America, and she's a script writer. She used to be, it was quite funny because she used to work as a hairdresser in a hairdressing salon, which happens to be on New Cavendish Street, where I went to university, and or poly as it was in those days. And she said, yeah, and then I told her about the book, and then she started telling me about her experience when she was a little girl. And because her eyes were kind of slanted, she remembers, coming out, and she grew up in Durham, which is interesting because I did training for Durham some time ago. So I was telling her about conversations around kind of the mining villages and whatever. And she says, yeah, I totally remember some of those experiences. And she told me about the racism and discrimination she faced, even though she's a white woman, but purely based on the way she looked. So, she would be called, they'll talk about her eyes and, and do a lot of kind of, and I'm not going to say what they said, but it was very kind of racist language based on her appearance. And she kind of remembers her grandmother, just, trying to support her in kind of, recognizing that actually, she was who she was, and she, and so forth. But she said that her experience of that kind of that discrimination based on her looks, really kind of stayed with her, and she had found it really difficult to reconcile, right? And it was at that point I sort of say to her, gosh. And then she said to me, that should be your next book. And that's when I kind of thought, about the kind of the different case scenarios, and then analyzing them and trying to get a sense of what are the lessons behind this and what are they saying?
Yeah, I mean, going back, to our earlier conversation and me saying about, it's not always yes or no, you're being a barrister. And then what you're saying about that guy ending up in court and then him feeling how he felt. And to a degree, I feel rightly so, not because of why he was in court, that should still have stood. But for me, the problem with the court is that the court system doesn't link two events very well. I mean, it's only just recently that you can actually talk about how somebody, like in domestic violence issues, about how somebody has a history of things. It used to really just say you can only talk about this actual incident. And then, of course, how do you really understand what happened? And if you can't understand what happened, you can't decide what to do about it. And the court says you don't need to, because, it's just, if you've done this, you get that. And it seems to me that his frustration comes from that. And that doesn't take away from the fact that what he did was wrong and what he did should be sanctioned. But it somehow has he shown any awareness of the frustration of the situation, how the frustration of the situation he felt mirrors the frustration of that scenario about, if you talk to a Black person, it's always about race.
Mm. Yeah. So what you're talking about is almost like, the empathy, it kind of getting to being able to get a sense of what it's like to be in someone else's shoes, right? In a roundabout way.
Well, yeah, yes and no. It's also about trying, like, if you want your history and your reason for being there taken into account, that should be a rule for everybody.
Yeah, and he talked, and I think the answer to your question is yes. I think in that conversation he demonstrated that he recognized the need to treat everyone with respect. So he talked about treating people with respect, and kind of saying that, what he wanted was to be treated with respect, and that he also recognized that he needed to offer the same level of respect to the two colored guys, which he hadn't done at the time during that conversation.
Irrespective of, yeah.
So, and he just said, what he had taken away from that and what he lives by is that you treat everyone the way you want to be treated.
Yeah.
which I thought was really powerful.
Yeah. So, but that doesn't, you know, all community stories are complex. And if we go to the story of that little girl, apparently she was carrying something which was interpreted as a weapon. And that part of the scenario, I have no idea whether this is true.
Which one is this? Child Q
This
or
is
the
the
other one?
second one. The
Right,
second
okay.
one. Apparently, part of that scenario was that she wouldn't give it up.
Okay, I've not heard that, but I've only heard, you know, I've heard bits of the, you know, of the news. I've not necessarily heard the
Right.
So what do they say what was she carrying then?
I don't know, because I heard this like
Is this the girl who was described as, because her mother
okay.
she was mixed Olivia, was she mixed parentage?
She was the Olivia child.
Yeah, because
And
her mother said, because the other factor which needs to be taken into account in terms of Olivia was that her mother described her as being on the autistic spectrum.
yeah, well, again, that's under dispute because
okay.
You know, there's a history in, so the story that I heard, again, through somebody who'd heard something, and who knows what any of it is correct, right? But the story was that the family has been stressed over time.
So hold on, I'm going to stop you there. Where did you hear this, and how
I heard it through somebody who had read about it in the garden.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So the details were that that this family was known to the police, right? That already makes them behave differently. And I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong. I'm just saying. The way that people who've had a bad experience with, I mean, that's two-way. The way that families who have had a bad experience with the police now tell a story that involves the police will also take a different stance, right? So it's not to dispute her. So
it's not to say what they did was right? It's
not to say what anybody did was right.
Yeah.
Or wrong, even. It's not to say that it was wrong either. You know, it was not necessarily wrong for the girl to do whatever she did, or for the mother to say whatever she did. The police
strip search.
Okay.
Is wrong, right? In the without an adult.
There will be some things that otherwise the story is not going to get told, really, and for sure. Right. So back to that story that you were saying from that guy. If it was true that they were trying to get into his car, that's wrong.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think anyone, and I think that was one of the things I said to him, that actually, you know, the way he had been treated in terms of their county described, you know, certainly they were in the wrong, but equally he was in the wrong for the way he reacted.
Right.
You know.
So now we go back to this scenario with this poor little girl. For me, the absolute wrong was that whatever happened, whatever the police did or didn't do, it shouldn't have happened to a 14-year-old girl on her own.
Yeah.
Right. So whether they strip searched her or they didn't strip search her, the fact that there wasn't anybody else there neutral.
And the fact that, from what the mother has said, she had phoned up to let them know that her daughter was autistic, and that that she didn't like being touched, and yet they went on to handcuff her and then.
Right. I mean, handcuffing a 14-year-old girl. I mean, seriously. So, you know, all of these scenarios, there are things that people have to put their hands up to and say that was wrong. And that's what that story that you sent was really good, is that both, well, he clearly has put his hand up. I wonder whether the other people have. And I wonder if they did, how much difference that would make to him in not generalizing in the future. How much is tied up with mutual respect and mutual responsibility.
And
yeah, I'm not saying that everybody needs it, but in terms of a program, putting a program together, and what makes it different is that if the focus isn't just on the police, if you don't go to the police and say, we are here to change you, if you go along and you say, we are here to change your relationship with the community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Community have to be involved. So we're not saying you sit all in a room. I think that's different.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious that it needs to be done, but I'm just putting it into that package.
Yeah. And I think that's really where, because there was on the BBC News today, there were some young people, young ethnic minorities who were being interviewed about their experiences of the police. And I think, in a sense, in any training, you've got to be able to bring in the different voices and the different narratives and get that opportunity for both sides to be able to say what their experiences are and what's going on. So I think it's important.
Well, it's not just about hearing, although to your point earlier, that is a crucial point of it, but it's also about them growing a difference together, not somebody else telling them.
Okay, say a bit more.
So you said there has to be conversations where all you're doing is listening.
Yeah, to listen to understand rather than to listen to
respond.
To respond, that's it, yeah.
Right. So I'm not trying to detract from that at all, because that is a crucial point of the program that we're evolving here. But at the point at which you are then going to look at when the awareness comes, or even as part of, okay, let me tell you a different context, a different scenario, which I think explains it. So there's a group that I've been working with in Rwanda who work with fathers, and their work developed out of issues around domestic violence. So what they were looking at was trying to build better relationships between couples and between couples and the children, because the children were found, the arrival of children and the stresses of the arrival of children were found to be a trigger point around some of the abuses that were going on. Anyway, they started off trying to work with the dads to bring them in as dads and not just a man in the household. And they realized that just sort of telling stories had its value. But, some people were convinced, but they were probably people that were on the cusp of believing that anyway. And some people were not, about that a man has a role as a father and not just as a provider. So they challenged some of these men. They said, okay, so you don't believe us, that's fine, you don't need to believe us. But what we want you to do is, here's an activity on a card, go do that with your child. Just do it, right?
Right, yeah.
Read the instructions, go do it, come back, let's discuss it. And what they found was that in the non-believers, they would come back and they would say, well, I still don't know if I believe you, but I really enjoyed myself.
Right, yeah.
So there were all sorts of channels and ways that they went round to that paradigm shift. And so now how would I apply that for this is that at some point that activity has to take place. So something needs to be done together between the community and the police. Whatever is that activity, we can evolve that thought. The intention is that they continue to work together to grow a set of processes around their relationship, rules and stuff, that's got nothing to do with you or I, if we're the ones that are involved in this, that they continue to do it. So if you take Olivia's story, it would be, what do they feel? What does the community want, so that, for example, when the mother phones up, she's got some sense of trust that somebody's going to bloody listen to her.
Yeah. You should have a look at the Journal of Child Psychology. I edited a journal about it must have been around 2000, and I actually wrote an article within that journal around some work which I did with a London local authority, where the local authority were looking to build bridges. This is my words. We're looking to build bridges with the Asian community, because of the Asian community's concerns and fears that the local authority was sending all Asian children into special schools and MLD schools. And the way we structured that, which I think is similar to what you're describing, was very much about bringing both sides together to have a conversation around the issues, and to really think about actually, what does each side want, and how do we reach that? So it is very much kind of a community, local authority, initiative, really, in kind of listening, to understand, so that we can actually come up with, with a way forward which supports and serves everyone and shows that mutual respect.
So it's a combination of, talking awareness, but also some setting up structures and so that it's not just talking about things changing. It is about actually doing things differently and feeding that back into the whole process, which is the story about these games that they were playing with their children.
Yeah, absolutely. And being clear as to, if things were to change, what would that look like? And, and kind of the contribution from both sides. So it's not just, as you say, it's not just the talking, it's about having, that clarity of vision about actually the doing. Yeah.
But the doing is not right. You go off and do what you think you should do, and you do what you think you should do. It's about doing it together.
Yeah. Coming to an agreed, an agreement about what needs to be done and how to move forward with it.
So my proposal would be that, if we're going to put this proposal together, is that you look at managing the 6 stages framework component, and I look at managing this community narrative component, and and then you think of what role might I or not have in that first component, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Interesting.
That would be where I had got to earlier today in my thinking.
Yeah, no, interesting. Okay. So yeah, no, I think that could work.
But again, I'm not sure. I mean, the time is right because they've said it, but I'm not sure one needs to be panicked